Hello, welcome to your biology video for Tuesday, April 14th. I want to start off by reminding you that you're going to have a quiz tomorrow on mollusk, echinoderms, and arthropods, and your test on those organisms is going to be this Friday. Okay, so I want to kick off a new unit today before I give you an assignment. And the topic that we're going to be covering now is going to be vertebrates. And this topic begins in chapter 17 of your book. And I have included the notes that I'm going to go over for a couple of minutes now as an attachment to this announcement. So again, if you want to print them out and put them in your binder, great. If you just want to save them as a Word document and file them away on your computer, that's fine too. But I'm just going to go over basically the introductory material to chapter 17. Okay, so let me go there. This is the note sheet that I was talking about. And you'll see that there are just a couple of objectives that are covered in these notes. We're going to talk about what is in this phylum, this animal phylum called Phyllum Chordata, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between ectothermic and endothermic vertebrates. Okay, so the Phyllum Chordata contains the vertebrates, or the vertebrates, and we learned about them in 7th grade, of course, and you learned about them all throughout elementary school. The vertebrates are the animals that most people bring to mind when the name animal is said. They include all the things with the backbone: reptiles, amphibians, birds, fish, and mammals, of course. But the Phyllum Chordata, while it does have the vertebrates in it, it also has a couple of other types of organisms that are grouped into that phylum that share characteristics with the vertebrates, but do not have a backbone and do not have a skull. And so we are going to talk about what it means to be in the Phyllum Chordata. Now, in the Phyllum Chordata, there's a subphylum Vertebrata, and that's where the vertebrates go. But there are a couple other subphyla where other organisms that aren't vertebrates but are chordates fit in. So let's talk about what has to be true of you to be included in this animal phylum, the Phyllum Chordata. Now, so we're in the kingdom Animalia still, and now, instead of looking at an invertebrate phylum, we're looking at the vertebrate phylum, and this is the Phyllum Chordata. So to be included in the Phyllum Chordata, 3 things have to be true of you. You have to have a dorsal notochord, and that is what's listed here. You have to have a dorsal tubular nerve cord, and you have to at least at some time during your development have what are called pharyngeal pouches. So you notice skull and backbone are not listed on that short list because not all organisms in the Phyllum Chordata have them. So a dorsal notochord. So a notochord is, as described here, it's just this rod of tough tissue that runs the length of the animal's body and is its primary means of support. In most chordates, and most chordates are vertebrates, this notochord develops into vertebrae, as you see here, becomes the vertebral column or the backbone. But in some organisms, they don't keep their notochord once they're adults, or they keep their notochord and it never develops into a vertebral column. But to be in this phylum, you have to have had, at some point in your development, a dorsal notochord. And that's, of course, where we get the name chordata because of this notochord characteristic. Okay, to be in the phylum Chordata, you also have to have a dorsal tubular nerve cord. So that would be our spinal cord, which is encased in our vertebrae. The nerve cord is dorsal to the notochord. So it's more towards the back than the notochord. And of course, it serves, just like in our body, it serves as the connection between the brain and the rest of the organism's body. So again, in many species, which would be the vertebrate species, the notochord becomes the vertebrae, and the vertebrae encase the nerve cord to protect it. Okay, so pharyngeal pouches, these are folds of the skin along the what would be considered like the neck of the organism. All chordates have them during embryonic development, and you see them shown here. In most, if you're talking about like an aquatic chordate, then those pharyngeal slits normally become gills. But if you're talking about terrestrial animals and say like man, then these slits develop from the embryo. They develop into structures in the neck and the upper chest. There is one class of organisms that keep their pharyngeal slits throughout adulthood, and so they're not just found in the embryonic stage. Okay, so again, to be in the phylum Chordata, 3 things have to be true. You have to have a dorsal notochord at some point in your development. In most chordates, which are vertebrates, that notochord develops into the backbone. You have to have a dorsal tubular nerve cord, and in most vertebrates, that dorsal tubular nerve cord becomes encased in the vertebral column. And you have to, at some point in your development, and it's almost always the embryonic stage, have these pharyngeal pouches or pharyngeal slits. Okay, so if you can check off those 3 boxes, you belong in the phylum Chordata within the kingdom Animalia. And so we're going to talk now about the 3 subphyla of the phylum Chordata, which I've referred to some but haven't gotten specific about. The first subphylum that we're going to talk about is the subphylum Cephalochordata, and these are the chordates that keep their notochord for their entire life. And the classic example of them is this little animal called a lancelet or an amphioxus. 3 of them are shown here, kind of with part of their body burrowed in the sand. This is a diagram of the internal structure of the amphioxus, and you see here's their dorsal notochord in sort of this orangey color. It doesn't develop into a vertebral column. You see the dorsal nerve cord being more dorsal than the dorsal notochord, and their pharyngeal pouches have become gill slits that allow them to respire, sort of like a fish. A fish is a true vertebrate, so these are not fish. A fish has a skull and a bony skeleton, but similar to a fish in the way that it respires and its kind of general shape. Okay, so that's the subphylum Cephalochordata. Another subphylum is the subphylum Urochordata, and these are the little guys that keep their pharyngeal slits into adulthood. They don't keep their notochord, and they don't keep their dorsal nerve cord past their larval stage, but they do keep their pharyngeal slits. And they're little sponge-like creatures in that they're little filter feeders, and they pump water through their bodies and filter food out of it. These are tunicates or sea squirts shown here. And this shows you that in the larval stage of the sea squirt, you'll see the nerve cord, the notochord, and the pharyngeal pouches. But when the tunicate or the sea squirt becomes an adult, it loses the nerve cord and the notochord, but keeps the pharyngeal pouches, which develop into slits that filter the water as it comes through their bodies. Okay, and then you have the subphylum that we're all most familiar with within the Phyllum Chordata, which is the Subphylum Vertebrata. And these are organisms that develop a vertebral column or a backbone before they are born or before they're hatched. And so you all are very familiar with these: fish, birds, reptiles, amphibians, mammals. If you're an evolutionist, you would put man in this same category as a type of mammal. While we obviously do share many characteristics of mammals, man was specially created and not really, I wouldn't put him in the kingdom Animalia. And so there is a whole method of classification called baremnology that is based on the created kinds in Genesis. And so the organisms are put into categories based on the kind of organism, the biblical kind that they are. And so, of course, man would be like in humankind, even though he shares a lot of qualities with mammals, obviously. Okay, so speaking of these different types of vertebrates, animals that have a true backbone and skull, there are classes. It's kingdom Animalia, Phyllum Chordata, Subphylum Vertebrata, so kingdom, phylum, class. There's classes in this subphylum that we talked about in 7th grade, and we'll talk about again briefly here, but we'll focus mostly on the mammals because of the rat dissection and because we want to talk about human anatomy, which obviously is very similar to mammalian anatomy. So there's 3 fish classes: Agnatha, Chondrichthyes, and Osteichthyes, depending on whether they have a jaw, and if they have a jaw, do they have a cartilaginous skeleton, a skeleton made of cartilage, or bony skeleton. And then, of course, you have your amphibians, your reptiles, your aves, which are your birds, and your mammals. Your book does a really nice job of summarizing the characteristics of each of these classes in a table on page 393, just for your reference. Okay, so that's sort of your general introduction to what's in the Phyllum Chordata. Now we just need to talk a little bit about the difference between an ectothermic vertebrate and an endothermic vertebrate, because we're going to study the ectothermic vertebrates first, and then we're going to study the endothermic vertebrates. So you may remember from 7th grade that ectothermic means that the animal doesn't have the ability to generate its own body heat. It doesn't have the ability to maintain a constant body temperature above that of its surroundings. So the old word for ectothermic was cold-blooded. Fish, amphibians, and reptiles are what we would call ectothermic or cold-blooded. The endothermic vertebrates are able to generate their own body heat through changes that occur inside their bodies, and they often have really elaborate means to maintain their body temperature within a narrow range. So, for example, we can maintain our body temperature at around 98.6 with their, even if the outdoor temperature varies quite drastically from that. It could be as low as, freezing, or as high as like 110 or 120 degrees, and our bodies would keep their 98.6 temperature. Whereas an ectothermic vertebrate, its body temperature takes on the temperature of the surroundings. It doesn't have a way to change that. So if it wants to lower its body temperature or raise its body temperature, it has to move to a place that's warmer or a place that's cooler. The endothermic vertebrates are birds and mammals. As you might imagine, the advantage of being endothermic is that you're not dependent on a heat source outside of yourself to be able to stay functional and alive at different environmental temperatures. And you can be active within a wide range of external temperatures. This says regardless of the external temperature. That's, of course, not totally true, because if you're, in minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit, you know, you're only going to be able to be active for so long before you freeze to death, and we can't just pop you in the oven and have you being fine, you know. So that's a little bit of an exaggeration there, but I would say that you can be active at a really wide range of external temperatures. And so you're not so vulnerable to the environment. Okay, so that's our introduction to vertebrates. And let me see if I can get back to where I'm not sharing that. All right. The other thing that I want to have you think about today is finishing up the grasshopper dissection. So yesterday I had you watch part 1 of the grasshopper dissection, where the teacher mostly looked at the external anatomy. Today I want you to watch part 2, and it's about like a 4-minute video that goes through some of the internal anatomy. And then I want you to take the grasshopper dissection quiz, which will count as a lab grade. And that will wrap up that dissection. Once you do that, you're done for today. Just remember that tomorrow you'll have a quiz, and we will also continue with vertebrates tomorrow. Okay, as always, if you have any questions or concerns, you know, just let me know, and hope you have a good afternoon, and I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.